Welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast, hosted by Dave Roberts. Humanity possesses a unique skill, the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This podcast embraces that ability, offering learning opportunities through conversations with extraordinary guests. Dave aims to leave a positive mark on individuals around the world. So before you dive into today's episode, please share this podcast with your network, including friends, family, and colleagues. And please consider leaving a rating or review. Your support makes all the difference.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Teaching Journeys Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, and today I am excited to have as my guest Kira Shishkin. Kira is the CEO of informed.now, the news concierge service to beat information overload. Kira is a four-time serial entrepreneur, strategic advisor, and investor in the technology industry. His experience spans investment banking, corporate strategy, and private equity investments in category-defining ventures. His education includes University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, and Stanford. Kira was also in Forbes 30 Under 30. Kira, I don't remember what I was doing at 30 years old, but I sure as heck wasn't featured in Forbes, so congratulations on that honor, and welcome to the Teaching Journeys Podcast.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for welcoming me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we have to thank Candace Snyder. I know you were on Candace's podcast, Passion, Purpose, and Possibilities. And she emailed me and very excitedly said, you have to meet Kira Shishkin. And I trust Candace's judgment because she follows my podcast. She knows the type of guests that I look for. And sure enough, her intuition was spot on. And I've just been excited about our episode for some time now.
Likewise, I've been really glad that Candace thought of us and connected us so generously. It's been terrific being on her show, and it's exciting to be here as well.
And you have had quite a journey. I know you're a serial entrepreneur. You've had multiple businesses, and my understanding, you still are involved in a lot of different ventures in addition to Inform now. But you've had an interesting path to get to this point. So for those of you in my audience who do not know you, tell our audience about those experiences that have shaped who you are today.
I've always taken this for granted. It's just been my story, and it's been boring. But the more I tell it, the more I realize it's an uncommon combination to be born and raised in Ukraine and then come of age and spend young adulthood in Israel before then coming to the United States. And that's been my journey. That's been my path through some of the loudest and most consequential conflicts of our time. That's where I was forged. And coming to the United States with that sort of perspective and with that experience, that's definitely been a very consequential, very meaningful part of my personal story, my personal history, and is a huge component of what I do today with the informed.now project, but also across all the work that I do. I'm looking to sort of fill the gaps or take some of the chips off my shoulder for my story.
Yeah, there was a tragedy early on in your life too that kind of shaped things that got you from Ukraine to Israel. Share what you're comfortable sharing about that part of your life, Kira.
Totally. I mean, that was definitely a very consequential moment when I was really young. I was victim of a car accident. It was actually drunk driving from the other side. And that accident left me disabled for many years, cognitively, physically, emotionally, perhaps as well. And it took me many years to recover, and it was a daily effort. And that moment, I mean, if I took anything away from it, it was that you certainly can recover from some of your life's worst lows. But it's a decision you have to make every single day. You don't just get to wake up one day and say, okay, I'm gonna make a decision. It's a decision you have to recommit to every single moment for maybe the rest of your life. But for me, it was definitely, I would say a decade at least. And it was I feel like I'm still in recovery from that moment. But there's some insight, I suppose, from that experience into what I'm doing now, which is to a great degree, I've lost control of my attention for quite a long time, for multiple years. And I lost my ability to learn and to really think clearly. And those are just things I've missed so much that now, as I'm seeing this experience kind of happening at a large scale in America with how news are so broken, and it's so hard to think for yourself when it comes to political, economic, or any kind of current affairs content. I'm looking to sort of save other people to the extent that's possible, um, from the experience of disorientation, from the experience of being in that state that I was, which was a very difficult place to be. And so even now with the informed.now project, in many ways, we're looking to give people back the power of attention, the power of focus, and the power of clarity, all of which, I've lacked at a certain point in my life, and I really wanted them back.
When you talk about traumatic brain injury, I have a good friend of mine who is a long-term survivor of traumatic brain injury. The cognitive rehabilitation was arduous. The person he was before the brain injury, you would probably need a search party to find that person. Because as he explained to it, the person who he thought he was going to be and was no longer that person after the brain injury. It changed everything. And he had to reshape his identity. He had to re-engage in life very differently. And he took on a new set of challenges or a new career path that mirrored not only the strengths that he was able to discover, those newly found strengths after his rehab from TBI, but also to compensate for what he had lost. And I hear you have said you did the same thing because of wanting to focus on things that are concise, that are clear, that don't require a lot of attention, that also don't get us disoriented and confused with information overload. And I can see that is kind of your challenges seem to have led you on that path. Am I assuming that correctly, Kira?
Totally. And I was sort of trying to hint at the same thing where, my personal experience losing attention, losing my ability to wield my attention, losing my ability to focus, losing my ability to think clearly, which obviously is a prerequisite to thinking critically. These are just things I've missed so much in my life back at the time when it all happened. And obviously in the aftermath, helping others avoid that state, even in their daily lives, because there doesn't have to be a big traumatic brain injury accident for you to lose control of your attention, your thinking, your sense of clarity. And I kind of see that right in the United States with the way media has been designed as an ecosystem, as an economy. It's very much designed to take over your attention, to monopolize it, and to, in so many ways, to destabilize you, to trigger you into having strong emotional responses. And I just don't think media that triggers you, media that requires you to have these strong emotions of fear, of anger all the time, is very good, is very healthy. And so, obviously there's a lot of inspiration from my own path, but there's also a very real market reality and a market problem in America that appealed to me naturally because of background and led me on this path of, hey, how can we help everyday people think more clearly, feel more informed without being disoriented, without being overwhelmed, without being influenced along the way. And that's really the philosophical and the ethical kind of core tenets of the informed.now project.
What is the demographic of your survivors or subscribers? Excuse me. What is this? Of course, we could say survivors too, because anybody that has I think really has weathered the glut of information overload that comes from just network news are probably survivors. But let me start that question again. What is the demographic of your subscribers of informed.now?
Yeah, I love that slip. I mean, I think it couldn't be more accurate. And I would say it divides into sort of three main buckets. So I would say the first bucket is we are really working hard to become the default alternative to legacy toxic news for the young person. A person who's just entering the workforce, a person who's just finished college, if they want to college, right? They're starting to kind of find this interest in current affairs, whether it's professionally inspired or family inspired or immigration inspired or socially, they want to be part of conversations. And they don't feel like they have, viable options because all they have is Fox or CNN, and that's just a very high noise environment. And so they're looking for alternatives. And social media is not the best place to find them, which is obviously the default place. And so this young person, I would say Gen Z person, some very older members of Gen Alpha, maybe younger millennial, and sort of like young person bracket that's alive today. They're looking for their first new solution, their first kind of way to get informed. And we really care about showing up for them because I feel like the habits you build early on in your life are going to stick with you, of course. They're going to be very, consequential on the rest of your journey. And so we really want to show up for those people who are just buying their first newspaper metaphorically. We want to be there to support them. The second bucket is a person who's already read a fair amount of news in their life. They're maybe an older millennial, maybe they are a younger Gen X, and they are really looking for better options. They've kind of seen it all, right? They've read all the news, they've seen all these solutions, and they're so frustrated. They're like, oh, like there must be a better way. There must be a better way to do this. And I am seeking that because I've already seen all the other things. And then, of course, there's the enlightened sage character who has been in those roles before and yet hasn't, to this day, found a solution that works. Maybe they built their own aggregators. Maybe they built their own solutions. Maybe they even hired people to digest news for them in the workplace, right? An analyst of some sort, an intern. And they're like, at this point, I'm retired. I just want to know what's happening without being constantly bombarded with trigger news, with trigger information. And we're calling them this archetype, the enlightened boomer or the enlightened Gen X. And so folks that are really just have more time perhaps on their hand and they want to use it to be connected to the world instead of being further and further isolated from it. And yet no solution has been found, not to any fault of their own, but because no solution exists with that level of signal to noise ratio. And so these are kind of like our demographic buckets. Everybody is in the United States or Canada. So we're very focused on North America. And folks tend to be, or at least they used to be in the beginning cohorts of our work, used to be more educated, higher income, kind of more college graduate. But over time, and that's been really a big part of our mission, we have expanded and welcomed people from every walk of life, where it isn't just you've gone to college or you make a lot of money. It's for the everyday person too, right? A person who is waiting tables or working in the service industry or driving a taxi. It's for the everyday man.
I think that's important. You mentioned, somebody just like hiring somebody in an organization to filter out what news is going to be relevant. The issue I would see with that for me is that person, we would have to have a conversation to make sure we were aligned philosophically or close to being aligned philosophically. So that person would know this is the type of news I'm interested in. If you have somebody that I think has a different philosophy, they're going to be attracted, I think, a different type of news. And for me, that's not going to align with my philosophy and it's not going to be relevant. The other thing you mentioned just in terms of all the anxiety provoking and fear mongering that a lot of the major networks do to get fannies in front of their TV. You take a look at it, and I work with a lot of Gen Zs, I work with a lot of young adults, college students. There is a prevalence of depression and anxiety in that population. The last thing that needs to happen is they're getting their information from unreliable news sources or just they're getting bombarded on social media. They're getting bombarded on TV. They're getting bombarded anywhere. And that just enhances their anxiety. And I think it interferes with critical thinking because they become so anxious, they can't begin to really think clearly or objectively about which is fake news and what's real news. And, I've always told my students that if you see something on social media that says breaking news, it probably isn't. It's probably misinformation. So look at reliable news sources. And I do believe that SMS-based news organizations like yourself are going to be the wave of the future. I think I would see that as being maybe down the road, maybe not in my lifetime, Kira, but maybe in yours, where it's either going to be a really nice complement to what we already have, or it's going to replace what we already have. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Totally. And everything you're saying really resonates. And I would say this sort of maybe answers a question you may have had as well, which is why SMS? Like, why that channel? And it's exciting to hear that you also believe in that. And to us, it's about a philosophical and ethical alignment with the format, right? So much of what we're seeing in the news is a real cognitive kind of dissonance between, on one hand, news companies are claiming credibility. And they're claiming, hey, we know what's going on. We're truth seeking, we are accurate, and you can trust us with sensitive information. But on the other hand, right, and you're seeing this across the board, the ecosystem, right? What the spread of the newspaper, digitally or in person, looks like, it doesn't walk the walk of what they're claiming. It walks the walk of sensationalism. It walks the walk of clickbait. It walks the walk of, headlines that don't tell you anything about the issue except for getting you to read, getting you to click, getting you to sort of like buy into, oh, I need to see this, I need to click on this, right? As well as along the lines of, this is the pervasiveness of ads in everything, right? Everywhere you're looking in any sort of news spread is just peppered with advertisement.
Yes.
And that can be, we call it native advertisement, which is, let's just say for our purposes, solicitations into other parts of the same news companies, like, oh, subscribe to this newsletter, subscribe to this other service, subscribe to the puzzles, the crosswords, the trivia. Or it can be external advertising. It's like, buy this car, buy these socks, buy this financial plan, talk to this advisor. And that whole collection of just a cesspool of this noise, solicitations, advertisements, sensationalism, headlines that have no meaning, and all this kind of triggering language, it's completely opposed to trust us. We have the facts, we are accurate, right? How are you able to even square that? As a reader, how are you able to put those two together? There's no way. There's no way I can trust you with anything, because you're not doing what's good for me. You're doing what's good for your advertiser. You're doing what's good for your shareholders and for your, for your business. You're not interested in the reader. You don't care about the reader. And that's been like a big push for us into, okay, so we're finding ourselves in this maximalist world of media. Everything is thrown at you, bombarded, overwhelmed, overload. And SMS is the quietest form of communicating. There's no, incessant app notifications. We don't have email correspondence. We don't email people on purpose because email is very cluttered. There's none of that sort of demand on your time all the time of like, hey, click more, buy more, here's a video, here's a picture. It's very plain. It's intentionally very plain text. And to us, that speaks to the news minimalism that we're looking to pioneer and to put forward and to push as a viable alternative to the maximalism media ecosystem that's been haunting all of us.
And, I like the fact that it's, the simple text, because I think that's a symbolic statement against the sensationalism that we see in the news. And I'll tell you, Kira, where I see the sensationalism, and this aggravates me, and it's like the illusion of having both sides come on a program. So you could have MSN now have a conservative and a liberal, or centrist Democrat, or a centrist Republican, whatever. Okay, you can have that. Or you could have, and I've seen CNN do this, where they'll have somebody on the right and the left, because we want to represent both sides. But it becomes sensationalism for me when they start talking over each other and yelling at each other. That isn't news. What that is theater. And it aggravated me when I would see, well, we own this person on TV. I got 5,000 likes on X. Well, to me, who gives a crap how many likes you got on X? I didn't get the news. I didn't see the point of that whole interaction. What was it that you were trying to tell me about this issue that I need to know to function in my everyday life. I don't need the rhetoric. I don't need the drama. Just give me the news. And this is what I like about Informed Now. It's concise, it's to the point. Here's what's going on. You have links to other news sources, which to me seem to be very neutral, very information based, which leads me to my next question. How do you decide which outside news sources to link to? Is that a decision you and your team make? Is it basically, are there some other metrics that you've had as far as reliability of those sources, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, it's a very important question. Obviously, something that we think about every single day and try to optimize. We are happiest when we are able to lean into our kind of ground philosophy around primary sources are the truth, and anything that's going beyond the primary source is commentary. I love that you mentioned this example of so much of news discussions that are publicly broadcast, that are shown to people as like two sides talking, are not news at all. They're not informational. They are a form of entertainment that just happens to be news themed, right? And so it's news themed entertainment, but it is not by any means news insight. It's not by any means factual insight, which is ultimately what you need if you're trying to read news. Now, it is perfectly acceptable to be interested in news themed entertainment. Just call it what it is, right? If you're watching YouTube debates, one conservative against 20 liberals, or the opposite of that, right? Like, if you're watching any of that stuff, just admit to yourself that is not news content. You are not hereby being informed on the state of the world. You are being entertained based on a fetish that you have around news, or an interest you have in news, but it is not anything more than entertainment. And so, back to your question, we don't believe that the way to get to objective news, to signal rich information, to factual information, is necessarily having to read every single side, right? And there's at least two, mostly even three sides on any issue. It's too much. And you don't have the time to read news once. Most people don't read news anymore, right? I mean, for all these reasons mentioned, you don't have time suddenly to go from 0 to 3x the news. We believe that the way to do this is to read news once, but read news that really matters. And that is, it's the primary source. It's what happened, where did it happen, when did it happen, what's the immediate context that you need to know to understand what's happening. But saying any more than that is already getting into the realm of news commentary. And news commentary is entertainment. News commentary is a different realm that we as informed.now never want to play in. That's not our specialty. It's not an area that we are interested in sort of playing in. There is plenty of news commentary in America. Everywhere you go, every bar, every TV screen, every conversation, every family dinner table, there's plenty of news commentary. What's missing is the news itself. The news has long disappeared from public conversation. The facts have disappeared from public conversation. So, to your question around the sources, some 3/4 to 80% of our sources, and this is something that we really care about, are primary, which means we're not commenting on the quality of their credibility. For example, right now, there's a lot of stuff the White House is putting out that a lot of people would question the credibility of, right? We're not saying, hey, this is a credible source. We're citing the White House because they are the prime mover. They are the announcer of this event. They are the ones who said they're going to strike Iran, or are going to do something. Anything that's going to be said anywhere else is going to be quoting them. So instead of quoting CNBC about inflation, we're going to get inflation numbers directly from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Instead of quoting, for example, AP News talking about whatever White House is saying, we're going to quote the White House. Instead of talking about interest rates, right, and taking that from Financial Times or Reuters, we're going to take that directly from the Federal Reserve, right? And so it's about going to the primary source, which is very difficult. So finding this is actually very difficult, especially for a lay person or an everyday person. We specialize in finding the horse's mouth. We're finding the horse, and we're going to get to the horse's mouth, and that's what we're going to listen to. Anything beyond that is extraneous. Sometimes there is no primary source. For example, it's a wartime update on something that there isn't something that we can just trust and say there's a prime mover announcer. In that case, we do our best to find a source, an article that has the most primary reporting, meaning they were kind of like first to the scene and they have the reporting muscle to prove it. And ideally, they're information rich, signal rich, very low in noise. This varies. It's not always the same outlet. This varies per issue, per timing, but that is our fallback, is to go to primary reporters. We're not commentators. We're not, doing commentary as much as possible, but are really focused on saying, hey, we were there on the scene. Here's what we saw. That's what we hunt for in the absence of primary sources.
And it makes sense. And the other thing is, I mean, you look at the news networks, whatever news network, they have their slew of paid contributors that come in and do commentary on a particular aspect of the news. And, I've sat down and told my wife, I said, they seem to have the same breaking news story for that entire day. And they have different commentators from different perspectives and different backgrounds weigh in on it. That to me has got to confuse the hell out of everybody. It would confuse the hell out of me if I decided to sit down and take a study diet of that. So I like that you take the commentary out of it. You go to primary sources, and primary sources aren't usually, they don't usually have corporate stakeholders. These are just primary good information sources where, you get news networks, they're beholden to their corporate stakeholders. So they have to put out a product that kind of aligns with the people who are funding them. I think Ezra Klein, might have wrote this in one of his books, that the news directors will take a look and see what's going on social media, and that's what dictates the news for that day. In social media, there's a glut of misinformation anyway. And if news directors are basing their news on what's going on in social media and are not counteracting that with primary reference sources like you do, it's just going to cause more anxiety among those who are trying to figure out what's going on in this very polarized world right now.
I mean, ultimately, it's not just corporate interests that are being optimized for, but it's also the advertiser interests, right? The customer of the news industry has long become the advertiser, where the reader is no longer the customer. The reader is now the product that's being sold to the customer, and the customer being the advertiser. And I think this kind of sellout of the reader is one of the biggest sins in corporate legend, but especially in media, where the stakes are really high. And this matters a lot because how people understand the world around them, how they feel about the world around them is their life, right? Is the basis of their decisions and how they experience life. And to have an environment in America, which we have, where every major news company has transitioned into being an advertisement company, I think it's deeply unethical and highly concerning, right? A phenomenon where you're no longer being optimized for, you're no longer being served, you are now being harvested in order to be sold to the advertiser. And I just think this switch, I think it obviously is broader than just media, but media is such a big part. It's a changing of priorities to honor advertiser instead of honoring the user. And I just think that's probably our biggest innovation. One of the things that we do, and we swear by it religiously, is we put the user first. We put the reader first. And we do not falter on that commitment because we only exist to serve the reader. If the reader is not happy with us, we should not exist. We'll go find and do something else, but we're not going to pretend to deliver value to the reader and then turn around later and sell the reader to somebody else. We're not going to do that. And it has been done. That's been the status quo operation across the legacy news industry.
Yeah. And the other thing is that I've seen links to stories and that network news doesn't cover. These are things that I didn't know this existed. I didn't know, this was even going on because, again, of what they put as a priority, depending on what's going on in social media or whatever else might be fueling what they do for news that day.
I kind of say one thing, because this is a question you asked earlier that I wanted to make sure I answer. I think that's another fundamental mismatch, right? Is these news companies, the modern news company is, or rather the modern legacy news company is optimizing not for accuracy or for significance of news, is optimizing for the clickbait sensationalism value of like, are people going to read this? And how can I make people read this?
Yeah.
How can I make this more breaking, more dramatic, more shiny, so to speak? That's structural sensationalism. We've all come to accept as if there's no alternative, is the biggest sin. To me, the decision to transition a business into advertisement, which is what we're talking about, has been done by all the major news companies. That is obviously terrible, but it is just one step towards what's ultimately happening, which is the real problem, that it has caused a structural sensationalism across media. Such a structural sensationalism, in fact, that you can't even undo it, because it's been so eaten up and just taken on by the industry. You almost cannot not sensationalize things anymore, right? Because it's this sort of like sensationalism complex of, if you're not doing it, they're going to be doing it, and they're going to get more readers, more clicks. I just think the whole structure of turning news into clickbait has been obviously wrong, ethically wrong, philosophically wrong, epistemologically wrong, culturally wrong, socially wrong in every way. And what we do with informed.now is the opposite of that. We don't want to be read more than we are due. Our whole focus is not how can we increase our footprint on the reader, in the reader's mind, but in the opposite. How can we take up the least amount of time, but still give the value of being informed to our user? How can we take up the least amount of time? And so we prioritize significance. If a news is significant, meaning it's going to change life on Earth, then we're going to be talking about it. But if it's anything about sports, or Taylor Swift is having a child with an affair with a boyfriend with Donald Trump, like, no, all these buzzwords, they are not information. They're also not really consequential information, right? Like this whole Epstein scandal, like, yes, it's this big, terrible story. Is it going to change your life? No, it's not going to change a thing about your life. You're just being led from Diddy scandal to Epstein scandal to Trump scandal to some other scandal. You're being led like a horse. You're being disoriented and distracted around sort of this whole ecosystem that's not telling you anything that's actually going to influence your decision making. But you know what will? Interest rates, right? Inflation, decisions around tariffs, decisions around trade, decisions around security of this country, security of another country. Major cybersecurity laws being passed, AI development, scientific breakthroughs. There are things that are not on the usual sensationalist reel that have a very real import on your life. And not only are they not covering them, they're not covering them with any sense of informative, insight-rich signal. We are doing just that. We focus on just giving you what's going to be consequential that day in that last 24 hours and leaving you the heck alone, because we're not trying to sell you more and more. We're also not trying to sell you to somebody else. And as simple as it is unprecedented in today's media ecosystem.
I remember growing up with the news, where we had news in the morning, we had local news in the morning, local news at noon, local news at night. And in the evening news, you had newscasters who believed in integrity in the news, like Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, Ted Koppel, Mike Wallace, Walter Cronkite, the pace setters. And now it's just this like endless noise of corporate sponsored, news programs and news channels and news stations and commentators, that basically it's just an endless glut of noise. And the consequential information is more like it's an afterthought to the sensationalism that these news channels strive for. And to me, it should be the other way around.
Exactly. And the critical thinking is in crisis, because when you're living in a media universe that's triggering you all the time, that's entertaining you all the time, that's looking to clickbait you all the time, it's hard to have any critical thought. It's hard to really think clearly about anything. And we are obviously optimizing for the wrong thing, or we have been optimizing for the wrong thing in the industry. And we're now living with the consequences of that. We're living with a country that feels disenfranchised. Whether you're asking the right side or the left side, doesn't matter. Everybody feels like they're not being heard. Everybody feels like they cannot really make informed decisions. Everybody feels very disoriented. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there is a general sense of dissatisfaction with media, a general sense of dissatisfaction with politics, no matter which side you're on. And a lot of that is not true. Like a lot of those are not things that are actually happening. They're things that we're made to believe are happening. They're divisions that have been fabricated. There are feelings that have been injected by this broken media system rather than actually being the fact of the matter. And how do you think critically when all the tools for thinking critically have been corrupted, either by corporate advertisement interest or by the structural incentives around sensationalism? How do you think clearly about anything? How do you even, ultimately, how do you make up your own mind without spending 3 hours a day, right, doing research work to just get to the basics? How do you do that in today's world, today's economy, today's society, today's culture? How do you make up your own mind? It's painfully difficult. And if you are even a little bit busy, which most of us are at least a little bit busy, most of us are too busy, right? How do you find that time? You can't. You don't have that time. And it just keeps getting worse. This keeps compounding on itself. It's about saying, no, the buck stops here. And we're going to build a solution that makes it easy and worthwhile to keep up with current affairs. It's going to make it easy and worthwhile to make up your own mind and be grounded in facts and in reality and not in talking head opinion on TV. And that's the spirit of our project of informed.now.
I think the other thing, this in society, everybody's talking about tribalism and polarization. I mean, tribalism, a friend of mine told me this, and, he's very studied on history, and tribalism is great for cultural traditions, for cultural norms. But then he said, what if somebody in the tribe starts lying to you? What do you do? Do you divorce yourself from the tribe, or do you maintain that loyalty because of what's already been established? And I think that gets in the way of critical thinking as well, too, is that we have to be able to determine for ourselves what's real, what's not real, what's the truth and what's not the truth. But so often we get aligned with a certain perspective that we just blindly take in that information because it feeds that narrative we've already bought into. And I think that gets in the way of critical thinking, too.
I think the social tribalism of the United States, it almost resembles like sports. Everyone's so obsessed with sports. It almost feels like politics is a national sport of sorts, either cheering for the Blues or for the Reds, but it's become more than just a political, ethical values system. It become a social affiliation, a cultural affiliation system where you're really just cheering on your sports team. You're no longer actually picking values, picking policies. You are cheering on a sports team. And that level of tribalism, I think it really has its limits. I think it makes a lot of sense to have tribalism in a smaller society. You naturally form two camps, there's two ideas. But over time, as the overall population grows, it's not really enough to only have two sides. Because as people start lying to each other within a single tribe, they can't really trust each other anymore. And they can't really be part of the same tribe if there's no trust. That tribe is doomed to break up. And naturally, over time, as the population grows of any ecosystem, more tribes should evolve, more than just two. To me, the bipolarization, the tribalism, the two-side tribalism of the United States is a huge mystery. But I think it's sort of run its course. Where we are 350 million people. We are way bigger than to divide only into two camps, right? And you can tell because a lot of people within one camp are dissatisfied, increasingly dissatisfied with the rest of their camp. And I think there are limits to loyalty in the long term around saying, no, actually, two parties is not enough. Two camps is not enough. It's going to have to be more. And I think that is inevitable in the long term. I think we're still living through the middle of it, where we're still kind of not seeing that schism happen. But I do think it is inevitable because the population is too diverse and too large to maintain such a homogeneity of just two parties.
If we can develop more than just the two tribal system, we're going to have a society that's going to, I believe, start embracing diversity, where we're going to come together, we're going to try to understand each other, and we're going to understand differences. But for me, I like to ask somebody, tell me how you got to that perspective. Tell me about what influenced your choice so I can understand it. And I may be able to take something from that perspective to incorporate my own belief system. But if we can kind of expand to a multi-tribal system where we have different perspectives from all different corners that represent the diversity that is in this world, we can have a society that's based on shared values as opposed to polarized ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I believe there's going to be a time where that's going to happen, where that's going to be the rule rather than the exception. Kira, it may not be in my lifetime, but I'm sure as heck hoping it's in your lifetime. Let's put it that way. So I've got another kind of off the cuff question to ask you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The traumatic brain injury. If you weren't in that car accident, do you think you'd be doing anything different right now?
It's a really great question because I don't have I have no way of almost like identifying myself without those core experiences. Like I don't know what the alternative path would look like for me. But I think for me personally, I've come from an entrepreneurial family. I've always been attracted to solving problems as the ultimate like reward of like life's work. Like being able to see a problem that's compelling, solve it, and find a way to solve it, find a way to help solve it for other people. To me, it's a very ecstatic experience. And I do think I would still be an entrepreneur, even if the experiences that I've had, the trauma that I've had, hasn't pushed me in that direction. Even more so, I think I would have been an entrepreneur either way. I think the problems probably would have been a little bit different that I would be solving, but I think I would still be in the business of trying to find problems and solve them, which is ultimately what I think of when I think of entrepreneurship.
I sometimes think, would my life be different if certain things in my life hadn't happened to me? And I look at it as I look at it for me as that I think I would be doing similar things. The content may be different, but the way I look at it is
Yeah.
I'm doing what I believe I was meant to be doing all along anyway, regardless of the circumstances that dictated it. So I listened to a podcast, The Lazy Entrepreneur. This was, I think, maybe a while back. There was something you said that struck with me, and I wanted to get your opinion on this and particularly how this has played out for you. You said something to the effect that prioritization is a discipline. How has that contributed to your success in business and in life?
Totally. I mean, coming out of my background of disability, I walked away with a very ADHD, very like hyper an attention deficit. And so I've always, to this day, have struggled to not have things to focus on. There are so many different things always like floating around that are interesting, that are exciting, that are shiny, and that are attracting my time and my effort. And for me, I've had to develop a discipline against that to see, well, if I keep bouncing around all these shiny different objects, I'll never get anything done. And I'll never feel the reward of like actually seeing something through. And so to me, prioritization has been a necessary cure to my diagnosis of like, you have to stick to things. You have to see things to the end. You have to prioritize because you're never going to be in a place where there isn't enough to do. There's always something to do. There's always something that's worth your time contributing to. And for me, I start every single day overwhelmed with a to-do list that keeps growing and grows every day a lot more than I could possibly reduce it. So every day for me is an exercise in, okay, well, I can't do 3,000 things today. What can I prioritize? And we always have more things to do than time allows. Being really disciplined around what is going to move the needle the most for me as a person, for us as a business, for our community as a whole, what is going to move that needle the most? And how can I prioritize that? And so that's the practice I'm on every single day is like, what is that top 3 list that if I get those done, I will be at peace.
Yeah, it makes sense because, like I said, we can't do 3,000 things in one day, but we can prioritize the top 2 or 3 things that are going to have an impact for that day. And,
Right.
just isn't about just writing down what you have to do for the week. I mean, it's part of it is doing a schedule, but doing a schedule is a lot different than prioritizing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have certain values that we care about the most. You know, on the business side, which is in many ways synonymous with how I think of my life as well, but we're always thinking about the reader. How are we going to make the experience the reader has better? And that guides our everything. I think the other thing is we're always looking for ways to create systems that are able to sustain themselves and run on their own through a mix of technology and talent and team and all the things we have with partnerships as well. Looking for ways to create systems that will run on their own. Because the sooner we can get that set up and running, the more time we're going to get back on our hands to things that are more one-offs, that are more not automatable, not repeatable, not systematic. We definitely prioritize systems a lot as like, let's build that first so it starts running versus focus on the one-off tasks and eventually get to the system, but we could have had it running the whole time.
Yep.
So there's a lot of systematic thinking around how we prioritize. And it's just always keeping the user in mind. It's always keeping the reader as like, how can we make their day better? How can we introduce something, do something, no matter how small, no matter how big, that will make the reader say, oh, this is great. How can we make our reader's day?
And that should be the focus of every business. They say the customer's always right, but that should be,
Yeah.
whether it's news, whether it's anything, to focus on what can I do to make my customers, my clients, my subscribers' life just a little bit easier and make us a little bit more informed, pun intended. So, Kira, you've left us with just so much good stuff. I could talk to you for about another 2 hours, but I know where you are in Japan right now. You've got some business meetings and everything to take care of. But I want to ask you if you could leave our listeners with one ultimate takeaway for today, what would that be?
I believe that everything that happens to you has the power to make you stronger if you let it. It may be deeply traumatic. It may be very, very taxing. But you have a choice. You always have a choice. Are you going to let it make you stronger or are you going to let it break you down? And I just think to the extent that you can make the right choice, make your own choice, you will be surprised before long as to what an impact it can have on your life. Right. And just, I don't know if there's much wisdom in that, but I just think everything has the power to make you stronger if you let it. And if you let it is the key part.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that because a lot of times people believe that because they've had the worst tragedy in their lives that they automatically have to become disempowered because of that. Or if they start re-engaging in life again, they're not honoring either the person that they lost or the significance of the tragedy, but in re-engaging in life, we're honoring that. So I believe what you're saying is we don't need to let tragedy define us, but we can define how we respond to it. And we can define what type of a life we want to lead in spite of what's happened to us.
Exactly. 100%. You said it better.
I think you said it great. I just embellished a little bit, Kira. I just embellished. And on this program, the customer is always right. But
I
anyway,
knew we'd see eye to eye.
yeah, that's right. We say eye to eye. If people want to get in touch with you, find out more about informed.now, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think if there are any news minimalists among us, a great place to go is our brand name is also our website. So informed.now is our website, and it has all the information you could need about our mission, how to join and how to be part of this news minimalism, media mindfulness revolution. It would be phenomenal to find people that are our people. And with me personally, I'm very friendly on LinkedIn or any socials whatsoever, from Instagram to TikTok to LinkedIn. I'm there. And I'm easy to find because I'm the only Kira Shishkin in the world as of today. And I'd be happy to connect with anyone who's resonating with my story or with our project.
And I'll make sure your contact information gets in the episode notes before we go live. So, Kira, thank you so much for just a wonderful conversation today. I truly enjoyed it. I hope we can do a part 2 sometime in the future.
I would love that, Dave. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And with that, that's a wrap on another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, wishing you peace.